Northern Ireland and the Troubles. Irish History of the 20th Century. After the Irish Rebellion of 1798, Great Britain wanted to restrict Irish autonomy. The Irish Parliament was abolished, and Ireland was now represented at Parliament in Westminster, losing its independence. The British thought it would strengthen the connection between the two countries. The two kingdoms became one entity named United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. From the beginning, the lost autonomy of Ireland caused opposition, but it would take almost a century until the legislative, in form of the Parliament in Westminster, took action. An important stepping stone was the founding of Sinn Féin in 1905 by Arthur Griffith. It is often referred to as the political arm of the IRA. The first Home Rule Bill in 1886 was not able to pass the House of Commons. The second one passed through the House of Commons but was vetoed by the House of Lords. The third Home Rule Bill in 1912 passed the House of Commons, but the Unionist majority living in Ulster opposed the bill strongly, and to appease them the bill was amended to include a temporary partition of Ireland. In 1914 the bill, now including the partition, was passed through the House of Commons. This time the House of Lords was not able to veto the law because the Parliament Act of 1911 replaced the unlimited veto power of the Lords with a veto right lasting only 2 years. The law was signed by the King and was about to go into effect. The path to Irish independence was just around the corner. The Irish luck was on their side. But then the First World War broke out. The law was postponed until the war was over. Unionists and nationalists competed for the favor of the British government, which led to a wave of support for the British in World War I. And the bad luck for the Irish was not running out. In 1916 a rebellion by Irish Republicans tried to establish an independent Irish Republic, while the United Kingdom was busy fighting the First World War. The Easter Rising was suppressed with force, and with much greater numbers and artillery, the British were able to defeat the revolt in only 5 days. Until this point, the public opinion was on the side of the British, but the harsh treatment of those who had taken part in the revolt opposed the public. 187 people were court-martialed and 90 death sentences were given. 14 were executed by firing squad. Believing Sinn Féin was the driving force behind the Easter Rising, which was not true, public support for Sinn Féin intensified. The Easter Uprising of 1916 was a turning point on the road to Home Rule. The peaceful movement was pushed aside by a violent path, and the Unionists felt their critical views of the Nationalists confirmed. The peaceful path was now blocked, and the path taken led to the War of Independence. The strong public support for Sinn Féin resulted in a landslide victory in the election of December 1918. They formed an independent Irish government and declared their independence on the 21st January of 1919. The British government reacted by outlawing the Dáil and Sinn Féin. The IRA began attacking the Royal Irish Constabulary. A war was about to commence. The opposing forces were the Irish Republic and the IRA against the United Kingdom and the forces consisting of the British Army, the IRC, and the Black and Tans. The vast majority of Black and Tans were unemployed former soldiers from Great Britain who fought in the First World War. The nickname Black and Tans arose from the colors of the improvised uniforms they initially wore, a mixture of dark green IRC uniforms which appeared black and khaki British Army uniforms. They served in all parts of Ireland, but most were sent to southern and western region where fighting was the most intense. After the collapse of the British in part of Ireland and the withdrawal from much of the countryside, the British offered a truce. The post-ceasefire talks led to the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The Anglo-Irish Treaty concluded the Irish War for Independence. It was the foundation for the partition of Ireland and established the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion just like Canada. The Irish island was now divided in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Britain kept control of 3 military harbours. The British were gone. But the treaty was not what the nationalist movement had hoped and fought for. Michael Collins, the Republican leader who had led the Irish negotiation team, argued that the treaty gave, quote, "not the ultimate freedom that all nations aspire and develop, but the freedom to achieve freedom." But not everyone shared his opinion, and the nationalist movement was split into pro-treaty and anti-treaty fractions. The split over the treaty was deeply personal, and many who now were on different sides had been close friends and comrades during the War of Independence. The IRA split into pro-treaty fractions which would become the regular army of the Free State and anti-treaty fractions. Sinn Féin also split into 2 parts. Former brothers in arms were now fighting against each other. The pro-treaty side was better equipped and had much greater numbers, and through this they won the fighting. Left behind was a deeply divided Irish society. An important fact for the future was that the defeated groups, the IRA and Sinn Féin, continued to exist after the war. The Free State was established as a dominion of the British Commonwealth of Nations. In 1937, the Free Irish State reformed itself and gave itself a new constitution. The old constitution was linked to the British and the Anglo-Irish War, and the government tried to undermine those links through this process. The Northern Irish Unionists were highly angered by this new constitution because it stated that the Irish territory consisted of the whole island and that the Irish had sovereignty over it. Unlike Southern Ireland, the majority of Northern Ireland's population were Protestant Unionists who wanted to remain with the United Kingdom. The border was drawn so that Unionists formed a stable majority in Northern Ireland. Catholics living in Northern Ireland were discriminated against in several ways. Even in towns where the majority of people were Catholic nationalists like Derry, Unionists held through gerrymandering political power. Let's watch a brief video about it.
The total Unionist vote in Londonderry is 9,000. And these votes put a total of 12 members in the City Council. The total Nationalist vote is 14,000. And these votes put in 8 members. Now note the curious situation. Most of the voters in Londonderry are Nationalist, but the council is controlled by the Unionists.
Discrimination against Catholics was widespread. The search for a job was a case where the discrimination was openly displayed. "No Irish need apply" was a very common phrase. The The civil rights movement, inspired by its American counterpart Martin Luther King, demanded universal suffrage. Northern Ireland did not offer universal suffrage at local elections. A large percentage of Catholics were not homeowners, and any person who did not own a home or pay rates was not entitled to vote in local council elections. The ending of gerrymandering, ending the discrimination in the allocation of public housing, ending discrimination in jobs, and ending police brutality. And they took their demands to the street. They demonstrated for their rights. The first march took place on 24th August 1968. This march was peaceful, but the demonstrations would soon spiral into battles with the police. The next march, held on the 5th October 1968, was stopped by the Royal Ulster Constabulary before it had properly begun. A stone-throwing confrontation took place between Catholics and police. Having pushed the police back into the Diamond, the fighting continued, and the next day petrol bombs were thrown and shops were looted. Both sides seemed eager to capitalize on this situation, and they had no inhibitions to use violence. The Ulster Volunteer Force, a loyalist paramilitary group, bombed water and electricity installations in Northern Ireland, trying to blame the IRA and elements of the civil rights movement for it. Because the IRA could not agree on a unified approach to the civil rights movement, it split into the official and the provisional IRA. The provisional IRA was much more prone to violence than the official IRA, which wanted to pursue a political path. The timber was piling up, and it would soon be ignited. The Battle of the Bogside was the ignition spark. It escalated into the Northern Ireland riots, and the Northern Ireland government had to ask the British for help. The British Army was deployed to restore order. The army was at first welcomed by the nationalists, but it was a short-lived welcome. Slowly, the people turned against the army. A turning point in this process was the Falls Road curfew, where the army had sealed an area with around 3,000 homes after gun battles with the IRA. Many people complained that they were mistreated by the army. Now the army was viewed as being pro-loyalist, and the IRA gained significant support. The situation was escalating, and the Prime Minister, James Chichester Clark, had to resign. His successor, Brian Faulkner, wanted to bring back peace with harsh measures. To facilitate his goal, he introduced internment, the mass arrest and intern of suspected IRA members without a trial. It was introduced on the 9th August 1971, and it caused outrage in the Catholic communities and agitated the situation further. It fueled violence across Northern Ireland, and 21 people were killed in 3 days of rioting. In Belfast, soldiers of the Parachute Regiment shot dead 11 Catholic civilians in what became known as the Ballymurphy Massacre. The internment was a failure, and more bloodshed was coming. In January 1972, an anti-internment march was held in Derry. British paratroopers, just like in Ballymurphy, gunned down 14 civilians. It was one of the most violent acts in the Troubles. The so-called Bloody Sunday fueled Catholic and Irish nationalist hostility towards the British Army and worsened the conflict. 1972 became one of the most dreadful years of the conflict. The violence continued throughout the rest of the 1970s, including a series of attacks in southern England in 1974 and 75. But the conflict now slowed down, and the Provisional IRA deployed a new strategy known as the Long War, a less intense but more constant campaign of violence that it could continue indefinitely. In 1976, the British government removed the special category status for paramilitary prisoners. They now were treated like ordinary criminals. This started a protest which would become known as the Blanket Protest in 1978. The quarrel escalated into the Dirty Protests. Prisoners refused to wash and cover the walls of the cells with excrement. This escalated further, and in 1980 the first prisoners started a hunger strike. This first hunger strike ended after 53 days. At first the IRA regarded those protests as a secondary matter and concentrated on their armed campaign. When the second hunger strike took place in 1981, the IRA had learned how to capitalize on it. A shift started to happen. Now their fight would not only be armed, but also political. It was the beginning of their Armalite and ballot box strategy. A ballot box in one hand and a weapon in the other. The man behind this strategy was Gerry Adams, and his political vehicle was Sinn Féin. The second hunger strike was a direct confrontation between the prisoners and the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. One hunger striker, Bobby Sands, was elected as a Member of Parliament during the strike, generating media interest all around the world. The strike was only called off after 10 prisoners had starved themselves to death, including Sands, whose funeral was attended by 100,000 people. The strike radicalized Irish nationalist politics and was the incentive that enabled Sinn Féin to become a legitimate political party, but it would take until 1987 for them to end the boycott of the Dáil. In the late 1980s, while the IRA continued its armed campaign, its political wing, Sinn Féin, led by Gerry Adams, sought to end the conflict through negotiations. But this goal would not be reached until 1998. The Troubles caused more than 3,500 people dead and more than 47,000 wounded. The Good Friday Agreement was a multilateral agreement that ended most of the violence of the Troubles. A key point was the principle of consent. Northern Ireland acknowledged that Ireland had a legitimate right to a united Ireland, and Ireland acknowledged that Northern Ireland had a legitimate right to remain part of the United Kingdom. The principle of consent also stated that a united Ireland could only be obtained by consent of Northern Ireland. Another important point were the Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. They had to be amended so that they no longer stated that Ireland had a right to the whole island. The agreement was signed on the 10th April 1998, and it was approved by a referendum in Northern Ireland and Ireland. It also contained the decommissioning of weapons held by paramilitary groups, and in exchange the early release of prisoners. British military would reduce its army personnel stationed in Northern Ireland. The agreement furthermore contained different issues relating to civil and cultural rights. The signing of this peace agreement was no guarantee for peace. It was feared that small militant fractions and splitter groups will remain post-conflict. Although the disarmament and demobilization of militant groups, some small fractions avoided elimination, transforming into criminal organizations, social groups, or legitimate political parties. Generations of Ideology, hate, and fear could not disappear easily, but the agreement was successful and an important stepping stone in the peace-building process and the normalization that followed. A generation grown up in violence is the legacy of this war, and now, 2 decades later, the Brexit threatens to plunge Northern Ireland back into a state of violence. Dormant groups could rise again in the midst of a post-Brexit Northern Ireland. How long will we sing this song?